Thanks very much. What I thought I'd do today is really talk about two of the main principles at work when we talk about the public, and particularly about how we secure the public interest. What kind of institutional arrangements that they underpin, and particularly in our systems of information and communication. I'm then going to look at the recent record of these institutions and the ways in which these principles have played out. And then I want to sketch an alternative model or method for discovering and securing the public interest. It's a method that takes something from early modern notions of a sovereign public and something too from the ideas of the High Enlightenment. Now, if we look at the rhetoric of post-war politics in both the United States and Britain, it's possible, I think, to trace two distinct accounts of how we can achieve the common good. On the one hand, we have the ideas that we associate with the New Deal and the New Jerusalem, the idea that rational planners in the state and civil society can manage the push and pull of competing interests. The liberal and fair-minded administrator takes into account the concerns of labor and capital, of manufacturing and finance, of the market and of the family, and so on. The key figure in this is the public servant, the elected representative, the expert from academia, or from the foundation, or from the bureaucracy. Such people have the properties of mind required to manage the complexities of modern government. And on the other hand, we have the idea that informs neoliberal economics, the idea that the sum of what people choose to do in free markets delivers the best of all possible worlds. It's an idea derived from 18th century political economy, and it's summed up sometimes in the phrase private vices, public virtues. So we may be self-interested as individuals, but what we choose to do in free markets delivers the best of all possible outcomes. To make what I mean a little bit clearer, let me give you briefly two emblematic figures, Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. Now, Keynes was a very model of the enlightened administrator. He was a titanic intellect, and he was committed to a reformed and regulated capitalism. This was a capitalism in which technical knowledge and a balanced and rounded view of life would win out over both leveling socialism and old-style laissez-faire. Hayek, on the other hand, was the apostle of individual freedom and the sworn enemy of the meddling bureaucrat. Far from striking a balance between capitalism and socialism, Hayek thought that social democracy of the kind that Keynes advocated was a staging post on the road to serfdom. And from Hayek flows Thatcher's insistence that there is no such thing as society, and the Conservative Party's mission in 1979, in John Hoskins's words, their mission was to deprivilege the civil service. Now, between them, the public service ethos and the market forces model more or less determine the limits of acceptable controversy and economic debate. When market forces ran disastrously out of control in the years after 2007, for a brief time, all the talk was of a return to Keynes. The notion that any other approach might be considered was apparently unthinkable to most commentators. At any event, you have the ethos of public service and you have neoliberalism. So how do you balance the technically sophisticated public servants in the state and the free play of market forces? That was perhaps the overriding question in mainstream post-war politics in Britain. And for about a generation after 1945, One Nation Tories and the Labour Party more or less agreed that public servants of various sorts knew best. They disagreed about what kinds of public servants knew best, but they both treated neoliberal ideas with extreme caution. Then, for about a generation after Thatcher, both of the governing parties tilted in favour of market forces. And with the advent of the coalition, we can now say that all three governing parties tilt in favour of market forces. Now, this is a caricature, but I hope it's a caricature that captures some important features of reality. What interests me today is to think about how these two organising principles map onto the communications field. In the United States, commercial values currently predominate and have grown stronger since the Reagan presidency. But note the strong sense of professional duties that many American journalists have. I'll talk about that a bit later. In Britain, public service ideas have a much stronger institutional base. We have a very powerful public service broadcaster, the BBC, as well as an array of private companies that take their chances in the marketplace, a marketplace that is still to some degree, regulated. Commissioning decisions, decisions about what gets investigated, and decisions about what deserves publicity, are in the hands of employees and owners who think of themselves either as public servants or as actors in competitive markets, or as some combination of those two. Well, how have these employees and owners performed in recent years? The answer, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty clear. Our major media groups do not provide us with accurate and timely information about matters of crucial importance. When doing so would interfere with powerful established interests. Now that might seem like a sweeping claim, but I think it is justified by the evidence. So let's consider two examples that I talk about in more detail in the book. First, the Iraq War. When they came to review the polling data from the year and a half before the invasion of Iraq, three academics, Evan Lewis, Clay Ramsey, and Stephen Cole, found that popular support for the war in the United States correlated very strongly with false beliefs. False beliefs about Saddam Hussein's weapons program, about his involvement in the 9/11 attacks, and about the levels of international support for a US assault on Iraq. Their research concluded, and I quote, "The administration, by giving incorrect information, can gain support for policies that might not be consistent with the preferences held by the majority of Americans." Though official claims were often dubious, as in the case of the Iraqi weapons programs, or demonstrably untrue, as in the officially promoted 9/11 conspiracy theory, the media passed them on and embellished them in such a way that very many people were profoundly misinformed. Writing in the early years of the 20th century, the great anti-imperialist J.A. Hobson described how a small body of men had secured popular support for an aggressive war in South Africa by, again I quote, "by the simple device of securing all important avenues of intelligence and using them to inject into the public mind a continuous stream of false and distorted information." In The Psychology of Jingoism, Hobson explains how those who relied on the media for their information about South Africa were subjected to something like an advertising campaign for the necessity and nobility of war. Constant repetition secured general assent. Hobson writes, "Many people are convinced that there was a Boer conspiracy and can even tell you what it was and what it aimed at, in the same manner that they are convinced that Coleman's is the best mustard and Bryant and May's the best matches." The system that Hobson described is still in place. The techniques of commercial promotion, demographic segmentation, market testing, and so on, have become much more sophisticated since his time. But the principles are much the same. Consider the answer of the White House Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, in September 2003, when he was asked why he was suddenly talking about Iraq. He explained that from a marketing point of view, you don't introduce new products in August. Now, we can talk about the performance of the British media in this context later, but I think it's fair to say now that most of the major media reported as fact things that turned out to be untrue. They also failed to report matters of pressing relevance, including the scale, variety, and mendacity of what the Americans were doing at home. And a second example. In the generation before the financial crisis began in 2007, the major media came to accept the idea that private actors in free markets could be trusted in ways that didn't create systemic risks. They shared Alan Greenspan's delusion. He called it a flaw in his philosophy, if you remember. His delusion that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, was such that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and their equity in the firms. Note how this famous flaw in his philosophy derived directly from his belief that private actors could be trusted to act in ways that avoided systemic risk. Self-interest rather than regulation would deliver the public interest. Note, too, that those who held on to principles of public service were powerless to stop the takeover of economics by the financial sector. In the words of the former financier and author Philip Auger, finance wrapped its tentacles around the relevant parts of the academic world. Like Greenspan, the media mostly assumed that there was no alternative to a financial system dominated by private banks that operated under an effective public guarantee. They thought that rising levels of debt were sustainable, and either income and wealth inequality didn't matter, or it was a myth put about by knock-kneed leftists. There was little need for the state to regulate. There was little need for journalists to investigate. And needless to say, there was no need to consider financial sector reform. The newspapers and the broadcasters could take what financiers said on trust. And as a result, as the former editor of the Financial Times, Richard Lambert, acknowledged in December 2008, precious few journalists gave any hints as to what was to come. As in the case of the preamble to Iraq, there were critical voices, and critical voices in the mainstream. In Britain, William Keegan, Dan Atkinson, and Larry Elliott were consistently critical of the notion that a debt bubble could inflate forever. But the overwhelming bulk of coverage assumed that the system was sound and that there was no alternative. In the book, I argue that these two now familiar failures are part of a much more extensive inability to provide the population with an accurate description of the world, when doing so poses a threat to powerful interests. A number of journalists have said that lessons have been learned and that they will be more skeptical in future. This is what they said after the savings and loan crisis. It's what they said after the dot-com bubble. It's what they said after the collapse of Enron and WorldCom. And needless to say, I'm sure that they will say it after the next financial calamity. The fact is that the shortcomings in the current media system are structural in nature. And by that I mean that the power relations within media institutions and the power relations between media institutions and other institutions in society cause these shortcomings. These power relations encourage some kinds of activity by individuals and they discourage others. Editorial decision makers are both extremely powerful and extremely vulnerable. If they are to build a successful career, they must develop a highly sophisticated understanding of what constitutes an acceptable line of inquiry. They must learn what Caesar called the ABC of power. As a result, the media are unsafe in key respects, most notably, I think, in matters of war and political economy. So the media system isn't working, but if it isn't working, what should we do about it? When they aren't insisting that things will be different now they've become more skeptical, media commentators usually put their trust in some combination of foundation funding, citizen journalism, and new technology. I don't want to downplay the achievements of citizen journalism or to deny that social network software can be extremely useful in circulating information, and indeed, I think as we've seen in recent weeks, in coordinating action in the world, particularly direct action. But these things are not a substitute for the mass media, however important they might be. Access to large audiences still depends on the decisions of editors in large organizations. Besides, investigations can be expensive and they can be time-consuming. Do we really imagine that we can leave it entirely in the hands of unpaid volunteers? And as for foundations, however admirable the work of organizations like ProPublica and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism might be, foundation funding retains an unaccountable commissioning structure. So a meaningful response to the glaring deficiencies in our news media can only come, I think, from a change in the power relations that currently govern news journalism. If we are to do that, if we're to change these power relations, I think we have to supplement market and public service mechanisms with something distinct from them both. And I think that some of the ideas from classical republicanism offer us just such an alternative way of securing the public interest. In a properly republican form of government, the citizen body acts directly to secure its interests. It doesn't rely on well-meaning experts, and it doesn't leave everything to an unregulated market. Instead, citizens collectively own the state, and collectively they are able to limit its operations and to shape property relationships in ways that preserve republican rule. In other words, as well as freedom from constraint, citizens have the power to control the conditions of their shared life. They are free, but crucially, they live with a reasonable confidence that they can remain free. Now, traditionally, republicanism operated on the scale of a city-state or of a small town, and we think of the American Midwest in the 19th century. Or at most, we think of a collection of quite small states. Think of Holland in the early years of the Republic, Switzerland to this day, and again, the early American Republic. I think, in a sense, we can trace modern fear and hatred of Washington in contemporary America as part of the afterlife of this effectual republic. Central power was dangerous because it was distant and it was hard to police. Local government could be kept under close surveillance by an interested public. As the United States expanded, many people concluded, reluctantly or not, that an active public could no longer control the state in the way that it had. The problem they saw was the problem of information. How can public opinion keep up with the complexities of large-scale administration? I don't have time to talk about this in much detail, but I think the solution that they ended up with was something like a national system of knowledge that Walter Lippmann described in his books, Public Opinion and the Phantom Public. And in his conception of how America would function as a great power, public servants would be responsible for establishing the facts and managing things for the best. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that notion has really gone underground in some senses in the United States. but it still, I think, informs something of America's journalistic culture. So how can an active citizenry manage a medium-sized or even a large polity? In The Return of the Public, I argue for public commissioning as an essential first step towards effectively Republican democracy. Rather than relying on the personnel of market and public service institutions, we each of us have some power both to direct and to publicize journalistic inquiry and research. Such a move, I think, is essential because of the enormous constitutional significance of information. Public commissioning democratizes two links in the chain of media production. Firstly, we democratize the distribution of material support to journalists and researchers. And secondly, we democratize decisions about what is granted access to a general audience. A sum of public money is set aside for the purpose. A move, by the way, that wouldn't have offended Friedrich Hayek if there are any neoliberals in the audience. Journalists and researchers post proposals for projects, and each of us votes for the projects that we want to see funded. And we do that on quite a regular basis, perhaps every 3 months. For those of us who are interested in new funding models, the approach I have in mind in this respect is much like a publicly funded and universally accessible version of Spot US. The results of these inquiries would then be published online, but they would also be voted on again to decide how much prominence they receive in the media forms that the public controls directly. As we know, local newspapers and regional television news are struggling in the face of competition from the internet, from cable and satellite television, and so on. Public money controlled directly by the public could be used to subsidize local and regional news media as long as the publishing agenda was open to democratic decision-making. This form of equality makes Republican rule possible on a much larger scale. By establishing a patron-client relationship between the audience and the journalist, public commissioning solves the problem of social and geographical distance by putting mediated information under the control of the people ultimately affected, which is to say the population as a whole. And public commissioning of this kind, I think, will have 3 important effects. Firstly, it would widen the realm of civic equality, a realm in which market relations are suspended or heavily qualified. And so it would allow individuals who are otherwise silenced or excluded to address others on matters of common concern. The very uneven distribution of the power to describe constitutes an important source of social distress. Social disparagement takes place through images and stories, and public commissioning would give everyone the power to challenge the claims made about them, whether they be ethnic minorities, women, the young, or the poor, or indeed anyone. Secondly, civic action in conditions of equality, that is to say, the process of gaining greater popular control over the climate of opinion, will make further participation seem less daunting or pointless. The practice of debate and deliberation and the experience of changing the field of publicity will provide us all with an education in government. And thirdly, and most importantly to my mind, by giving the general population the means to inquire into the nature of social arrangements, public commissioning can provide the facts and the publicity for those facts that constitute the only sure basis for political change. Public commissioning could be a device for exploring matters that are currently ignored or grossly distorted in mainstream coverage at the present time. Now, how would this work in practice? In the book, I set out a plan as to how one might do this, and I argue that for around 125 million a year, we could fund regional bodies that would hold and distribute funds to researchers on the basis of a popular vote, and we could also fund a full replacement for ITV regional news, on which publicly generated stories could find a large and regular audience. We could use a levy on the banks to fund public commissioning. The financial sector's ability to shape the field of publicity, to shape the field of generally accepted assumptions contributed directly to the crash, both here and worldwide. 125 million a year, it seems to me, is a small price to pay for ensuring that they don't get carried away again. And for about 125 million, we could pay 3,000 investigative journalists and researchers about £24,000 a year. We could also pay for a replacement for ITV's regional news service and have some change left for administration. Now, at the moment, there are only about 100 investigative journalism working full-time in Britain across all media. And they all depend on access to major media to have any impact with their stories. So it's time to break that monopoly and to see what happens when everyone has some power to commission and publicize research. Not because the current commissioners are drawn from an unrepresentative elite, although they are, and nor because the stock of widely shared assumptions and information is distorted by hidden subsidy and covert manipulation, which again they are, but because a public worthy of the name is a public that can discover its own opinions. And this is the difference between a public and a population. Now, as I said at the beginning of the talk, the ideas of the Enlightenment have to some extent informed my thinking on matters of media reform. And then in what I've just said, I've rejected liberalism and technocratic and scientific expertise as a basis for securing the common good. Now, that might seem like a rejection of Enlightenment principles, but the most important writer of the High Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, also rejects them, and he rejects them in an interesting way. In his essay, What is Enlightenment?, Kant argues that enlightenment occurs when we think outside of our institutional roles. When we reason as employees or as office holders, we do so in an essentially private way. We are bound by the logic of our interests and by the need to maintain social stability. When we reason disinterestedly, we reason in a public way. No institutional form, then, can expect to make good on our desire for enlightenment. In Kant's schema, even the state does not permit public reasoning. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so offensive when you hear people say that Kant was a timid political thinker. Because what he's saying, offensive is a word I didn't choose wisely or with deliberation, but it is offensive because what he's saying is that the King of Prussia is a private individual. And that's a profoundly brave thing for him to say. So next time you hear someone like Christopher Hitchens or one of the great sort of defenders of English liberty disparage Kant, bear in mind that he was banned from political speech in large part, I think, because of what he says in What is Enlightenment. Now, public commissioning makes public reason possible because decisions about what becomes well known are made by us as equal citizens. The journalists we employ will be self-interested, and we ourselves will be free to be self-interested in our commissioning decisions. But we will be free to be disinterested, to support inquiry because it is good to know and because we are willing to accept the transformative power of new knowledge. We cannot put blind faith in institutions, including the state. But if we reform the media in the way I've outlined, I think we can deliberate much more freely and in a manner that has some content on our shared understanding. And crucially, I think it will have some bearing on our shared understanding of what is politically possible and what is politically necessary. Now, recently, the RSA organised its activities under the phrase 21st Century Enlightenment, and I think it's a good watchword. Enlightenment in the 20th century, as in the 18th century, is achieved by the exercise of public reason. Public commissioning is the device by which public reason becomes both generally possible and politically effectual. Public commissioning gives us both a motive and a means to think for ourselves and to become enlightened. So embrace enlightenment in the 21st century and embrace public commissioning. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for that, Dan. It's very refreshing to have a book which not only explores difficult issues through a profoundly in a profoundly thoughtful way, but comes up with a concrete solution to those issues. So it's a bit unfair, but I'm going to ask you a couple of kind of very obvious and predictable kind of questions about your practical suggestion. And you have
I hope they're obvious, yeah.
The first is that you correctly identify, I think, that the problem in relation to Iraq, the problem in relation to the credit crunch, was not that there were not dissenting voices, but that the weight of opinion and the weight of power and the weight of money was overwhelmingly on one side of the debate. Now, how are your 3,000 investigative journalists dotted around the country working on a whole variety of projects, many of them presumably, knowing what I know about public opinion, working on kind of local issues, exploring whether Tesco should open a new store out of town, etc.
Sure.
How are these people going to address that imbalance in the face of whatever you might say was the agenda of Sky TV or the Daily Mail or anybody else? Won't there just be more fleas, as it were, dotted around, but not stopping the kind of the beast that is heavily financed mass public media?
Yeah. I think the first point you made in your preamble is very important. I think it is possible to discover information in a way that that was much more difficult, I think, a generation ago. But I think that an informed understanding remains alienating. I think that mainstream opinion it remains very tightly channeled. And I think if you start to talk about things that appear unfamiliar to a lot of people, you rapidly marginalize yourself. Now, the substance of your question about what do we do about, as it were, the big beast of this mainstream opinion, where you're only really carving canals alongside it. Initially, I thought that the model would be that you would have, as it were, a national bureau. You'd have regional bureaus, and you'd have a national institution that managed matters of national importance. And I realized that that was actually a mistake, because when you start to look at local issues in an unblinkered way, when you start to look at how it is that Tesco is planning to open a superstore, if you do that outside the constraints of the local media, for example, and you do it outside the constraints of local media owners, you very rapidly understand that the structure of planning is decided at a national level. So you then discover, for example, that public relations companies are responsible for managing public consultations. You begin to piece together a national story. And what I think, my hope is that rather than having an assembly of fleas on the back of an elephant, what you start to see is the creation of centres of national and transnational understanding that are not metropolitan. So you could have groups of people in Dorset who come to understand through the ordinary actions of a regional curiosity that actually there's a retired accountant down the road who knows quite a lot about offshore. So we can talk to him about how Tesco manages its profit streams and so on. So one of the great appeals of this idea to me is that it encourages people to realize that there is nowhere that is not part of the great world. There is, in a sense, no such thing as a regional story. Everything connects to everything else. And so I think it would be very difficult for mainstream opinion to remain unchanged by this process. If you can access reasonably large populations with ideas that are, as I say, are unconstrained by existing institutional arrangements, I think very rapidly the sorts of things that people say now will start to seem preposterous. So I think it will affect the general field, is my view.
And then if we're talking about this process of public commissioning, given a variety of kind of issues, low participation, kind of activist capture, these kinds of things, why is it that you think that the public, in the context of public commissioning, is going to be commissioning stories of public interest rather than using this as a process for pursuing a kind of narrow agenda or seeking to attack particular groups by investigating their behaviours, for example? I don't know, it's a trite example, but what would be to stop the BNP saying, okay, we want lots and lots of investigative journalism into the kind of lifestyles of various minorities that we don't like?
Sure. I mean, I think this is there are a number of responses to this. I mean, firstly, I think it would be wrong to imagine that we don't have a media system that does precisely this right now. If you look at the coverage, mainstream coverage of minority groups, mainstream coverage of the poor, and really mainstream groups of vulnerable people in society, you see something which is aggressive, it's insulting, it's disparaging, and it does, in fact, it does exactly what I think the BNP would be setting out to do in many respects. So we already have a media that is driven by very peculiar private agendas and so on. It's certainly true that if you give people freedom, they'll use it in ways that you can't predict. And it may be that people stay at the local level. And it may be that what I'm proposing is going to be a useful way of subsidizing community media and community or local newspapers. So be it. I doubt it, actually. I think that, I think as someone who holds to the principles of the Enlightenment, I think that people do want to know. I think people do want to understand the world in which they live, and I don't think that people's intellectual horizons are limited in quite the way that we sometimes think. But going back to this point, if we give people freedom, they'll use it in unaccountable ways. Public commissioning also gives us the means to destroy these kinds of descriptions, so that if there is tainted journalism, if there's journalism that is partisan or seeks to harm and does so by essentially mendacious means, it can be challenged. And again, my confidence is that there will be more people who are revolted by slanted journalism or intimidating journalism of this kind. And then there are people who enjoy it or find some sort of sustenance in it. I have to believe that people would rather not hate for no reason, which is what we're being encouraged to do. So I put my faith, yes, in the public, frankly. I think if you ask people now what they think about various groups in society, the answers will be quite unnerving. But I think that was largely a consequence of deficiencies in our systems of information as they stand.
And finally, before I open it up to the room, a kind of counter-proposal, if you like, or a kind of different way of looking at this,
Mm-hmm.
which is that the one thing that has grown to fill the gap in newspapers left by the decline of investigative journalism has been opinion. There has been a massive growth in opinion in mainstream media,
Mm-hmm.
opinion on the internet
Mm-hmm.
through blogs. And so for me, the worry about your proposal is that, yes, stuff will be commissioned, but it'll be commissioned on the same basis that it seems to be most journalism works, perhaps the way journalism always works, which is I'll start from the story, and the story has got to be one which polarizes the matter, because a non-polarizing story is not an interesting story. So journalism has an inherent polarizing quality to it because there is no real disagreement, or the people or the supermarket or the government is generally trying to do the right thing, is not a story. And so what you lead to is a slightly greater hubbub
Mm-hmm.
of people whose interest lies in polarizing disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for me, the problem is, in terms of public engagement,
Mm-hmm.
less about a lack of information or even less about a diversity of information. It is that the construct of most debates is of this form. It is of the form in which I say, I stand for fairness and Dan stands for unfairness, to which Dan replies, no, Matthew stands for unfairness and I stand for fairness. And I would say, this is not an exaggeration, 95% of disputation as presented in the media and politics has that form.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is, if you're a member of the public and you're very busy,
Mm-hmm.
it's entirely opaque. So you therefore have to rely upon other ways of adjudicating, which mainly comes down to emotions. You know, whose face do we like most? Who's most like us?
You would put it in a territory you would win, yeah.
You know, whatever kind of emotional link we can make, and of course we know lots and lots of evidence that people actually make most of their political judgments on this kind of emotional basis.
Yeah.
So for me, the challenge is not this lack of information, lack of opinion. It's how can you try to structure debates in order that, as it were, the sides are encouraged to agree about what they disagree about.
Mm-hmm.
In order that the public can say, well, in this battle between Tesco and the local community, rather than listening to these attempts to disparage each other
Mm-hmm.
and claim similar things for each other's case, actually both sides are going to work together to say, well, these are genuinely the things that we disagree about, and therefore the public is in the position to make an informed choice on the basis of a consensus about what it is actually at the heart of the matter. Now, for me, that would be potentially a much more liberating kind of experience than having yet more people saying Tesco's are all evil, ministers are all evil, whatever. There's no shortage of that, I don't think.
I mean, what you've described, I think, is in a sense, a rejection of pluralism. I mean, you're saying that what we don't want is a situation where people come as advocates for a position and use all means fair or foul.
I think pluralism needed to be based upon a kind of shared set of values and a certain kind of paternalism which has disappeared in society.
Well, that's as maybe, and I think you're historically absolutely right. But the notion that out of a contending public debate where people come in a gladiatorial way with a point of view and seek, as I say, by any means to floor their opponent, and then a public decides on the basis of which argument's still standing. That seems to me a perfectly adequate approach to matters of public concern. Where I think as you say, the kind of paternalist model of pluralism falls down is that it says, you know what, we're going to have a very exciting debate, but we've chosen who the speakers are. So there's someone in the background, usually a public servant of some description, who's saying, Matthew represents a legitimate point of view and differs with Dan, who represents a legitimate point of view. And somewhere in the wings, there's a bunch of people saying, yeah, but they're talking beside the point. Now, I'm all in favour of plural debate. I'm all in favour of a clash of competing ideas. And I'm all in favour of the idea that, as it were, the journalists or the researchers are going to be interested. They're going to have a dog in the fight. They're going to want to get their next commission. They're going to want to build their career. But it gives us an opportunity, I think, to have a pluralist debate, which isn't in any way rigged beforehand. You remove, as it were, the impresario who puts on the show. And that's where I think I differ from kind of traditional pluralism. Because at the moment, I think our notions of balance are to some extent managed. And I think our notions about what constitute legitimate debate are subject to prior restraint, if you like. And I think that's a major problem. Very quickly go back to your point about the proliferation of opinion. Opinion proliferates, I think, because it's cheap. We can go home after a long day and we can do an opinion piece on our blog, or we can forward something on our Twitter feed. It's quick to do. But finding stuff out is more expensive. And again, I have faith that people, if they have the power to do it, will pay people to find stuff out. So we won't pay for opinion so much, we'll pay for fact.